Are Mind Flayers ripped off from the Cthulhu mythos? I mean, yeah, obviously. But we found a specific inspiration that nobody talks about, not even Gary Gygax himself. Before we get to that though, let's cover some basics. If you've ever played Dungeons & Dragons before, and even if you haven't, you've probably heard of Mind Flayers or Illithids. These cephalopod-faced psychics have mysterious origins, terrifying powers, and horrifying motivations. They utilize psionic strength that can stun or mentally dominate their prey, forcing them to be servants or cattle depending on the day. Those that do survive are twisted by alien technology into new and more efficient servants. When stalking them deep below ground to their hives, many D&D players have been startled to discover full-blown spaceships called nautiloids in the caverns beneath their feet. In some stories, these creatures were an alien race from the end of the universe that traveled back to escape their fate. In others, they were beings of the distant far realm. Both of these seek to explain how even the aboleths didn't know the origins of the Mind Flayers, despite aboleth memory supposedly stretching back to the beginning of all things. But in this video, we're less concerned with the theory crafting of where or when the Mind Flayers came from. Instead, we want to look at where the idea of Mind Flayers came from, and what might have inspired these tentacle-faced terrors that seem more sci-fi than fantasy. So we actually know what the most direct inspiration for Mind Flayers was right from the horse's mouth. When asked about the inspiration, first and foremost, as always, Gary Gygax reiterated that Mind Flayers were created whole cloth of his own imagination, and then talks about being inspired by the cover of Burrowers Beneath by Brian Lumley. Specifically, the cover he seems to be referencing is Tim Kirk's cover for the 1974 edition of the book. The tentacled maw seen on the cover certainly seems to have a direct aesthetic connection to the Illithids that would soon follow. So that checks out. But there's clearly more inspiration coming from this book than Gygax's vague gesture to the cover lets on. The titular Burrowers Beneath are psionic worms with tentacled mouths that seek to dominate the world, which is, according to them, already theirs. This is a remarkable analog to the Mind Flayers' own motivations, and shows a more direct inspiration. Both groups are ancient and futuristic in the same breath. Both feel an ownership over not just the world, but life itself. And both make liberal use of psionic awareness to the point of full-blown mind control. The inspiration given by Lumley also points us to the next connection, the Cthulhu mythos. Gygax referenced the Cthulhu mythos and its strange deities both directly and indirectly in the life cycle of D&D, but never more so than in those early editions. The standout example in particular can be found in the first edition of Deities and Demigods, which features just about the entire rogues gallery of the mythos. What many people don't understand about the mythos, however, is that it was a shared universe. Lovecraft was publishing stories in magazines and periodicals, and occasionally other authors would write in that same setting well beyond the author's death. So it's safe to assume that Gygax, who was reading a modern mythos book in the 70s and referenced creatures from all corners of Lovecraft and others' works, was very familiar. The mythos is part of a genre called cosmic horror. There's some debate to be had about what makes something cosmic horror, but in general it means that the protagonist is facing a threat from the cosmos with an underlying truth that the struggle is either hopeless or very near to it. These threats often take the form of the ageless and mysterious alien, just one arm of an eternal empire that fell in the millions of years before mankind and may yet return. If it feels like I've stopped describing Lovecraft monsters and started describing the Mind Flayers, then I've made my point. This is another clear influence, but two specific stories stand out as the most influential. First are the Starspawn of Cthulhu. Now, despite Gygax's claim of being inspired only by the cover of the Burrowers Beneath, the Illithids' bulbous heads are a dead ringer for illustrations and attempts to draw Cthulhu itself. Specifically, the large fleshy cranium with tentacles draped around the mouth. Now, there's some debate on whether those depictions are the actual Nightmare from the Deep or just some kind of avatar or representation. But Cthulhu also has offspring called the Starspawn that are even closer in description. They're surface-dwelling creatures rather than aquatic, and were a favorite of Lumley, appearing in some of his other works. Descriptions vary, that's one of the tropes of cosmic horror, but they seem to be more humanoid than others in the mythos. On top of this, they also exist as remnants of a great empire scattered by a war that no human was there to witness. In some versions, it's a natural disaster, and in others, it was an act of war by another spacefaring race. which reminds us of the Githyanki and their endless war to purge the Mind Flayers. Add in some of the grim experimentation committed by creatures of mythos like the Mygo and the primordial ones from At the Mountains of Madness, and you're about 90% of the way there. This leaves us with one last question. Why the hell do they eat brains? This is our boldest claim, the secret that no one talks about. But there is a story in the mythos that seems to bear a remarkable resemblance to this particular trait. That's not to say that the Illithid are some grand act of plagiarism. Please don't sue me, WotC, or the Gygax estate. I'm just pointing out some similarities here. The story in question is The Space Eaters by Frank Belknap Long, a friend of Lovecraft's who would often put Howard and himself in his books. This is where things get interesting. In the story, a worm-like creature burrows its way into the skull of a friend of the investigating Frank and Howard. After some desperate fleeing and investigation, there's nothing they can do for their infected friend but to leave him behind and try to avoid the psionic attacks of whatever has taken him. This story, which would be very likely to interest an apparent Lovecraft enthusiast, provides us not with just more of the imminent madness of cosmic horror, but it sets up these psionic creatures that can levitate, stun their prey with psychic power, and devour brains, all the capstone abilities of the Mind Flayers. Now, this does leave one question. How do we go from psychic space aliens inspired by unknowable horrors to psychic cult leaders and rogues? Because if cosmic horror is all about an impossible struggle against creatures far more ancient and powerful than anything humanity can muster that we don't even understand, then the modern version of the Mind Flayer as a brain-eating imperialist that wants its crown back doesn't necessarily fit the bill. Well, the fact of the matter is, Dungeons & Dragons is a game about heroic adventures, slaying monsters and amassing gold. So some adaptations clearly needed to be made. In this case, the best option, depending on who you ask, is to hold on to the body horror and the alien physiology while making their goals easier to grapple with, and their physical forms just a bit more stabbable. As for the outfits, the high collars and villainous outfits were actually inspired by Ming the Merciless, the main antagonist of the Flash Gordon series, mixing that classic science fiction TV show vibe with the alien horrors of the mythos gets us a blend of sci-fi and fantasy that's captured the imaginations of audiences for decades. The end result is the Illithid as we know them now, ghosts of a mysterious empire that may one day return. Well, that's our theory. A blend of official references and more than likely inspirations that add up to the intimidating and extraterrestrial Illithid. So don't forget the next time you're worried that you dip into your favorite stories for inspiration a bit too much, or that you aren't always treading brand new ground. People have been drawing inspiration from the work they love for as long as people have been writing and telling stories. Do you know any sci-fi or fantasy books or even shows that you think might have inspired other D&D creatures? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe and stay foolish.